our first Mary Trevelyan lecture in a while is actually about Mary Trevelyan herself. It's so fitting that we're in this place, which was a big part of Mary's legacy, to hear a little bit about the book which has come out last month called Mary and Mr. Eliot. Mary was, as we all know, an incredible woman, a very strong woman, a very well-connected woman. And Ish, as it stands today, and you goats who are here with us tonight, are a lasting testament to that. Residents, new residents, mostly women I can see, this is a story of a great lady who's done many great things for international students in her lifetime. And it's a fantastic opportunity for us to learn a little bit about Mary's life before International Students' House, because that's what this book is about. And the letters that she wrote and left behind give a real insight into Mary's life, her preoccupations, her activities, but also into the poet, the Nobel Prize-winning poet T.S. Eliot. So we're really excited that we have Erica here with us tonight, who's co-written the book with Mary, who did all the trawling through the archives and the notes that Mary left and made some sense of it for us. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Erica. She's an author and critic, has written a number of books on various literary figures and others, and was literary editor of the Times for 17 years. She's now Goldsmiths Distinguished Writers' Centre Fellow and a contributing writer for The New Statesman, consulting literary editor for Harper's Bazaar, and lead editorial innovator for Created Inc. That's a lot of jobs, Erica. I'm just Dean of Student Life at International Students' House, hoping and trying to maintain Mary's legacy and all the good things that she established when she put this building into place. So please welcome Erica. Our thanks to her for being here, and she's now going to tell us a little bit about this amazing book, about this amazing lady. Thank you.
Are students so important? They talk a lot of nonsense. They think they know everything. They are easily swayed, unreliable creatures, full of enthusiasm, full of contempt for the old-fashioned views of their elders. But it is possible to sow the seeds of real friendship, tolerance and understanding, and much else that is good among the products of a free and democratic country. It is possible to send back to many lands young people with happy memories of England, people who look forward to acting as interpreters between their countries and ours. These people can make a real contribution to the peace of the world. So wrote Mary Trevelyan in her book, From the Ends of the Earth, which was published in 1942 by Faber and Faber. And the copy that I looked at that's in the London Library is on very thin wartime paper. You can really see through the pages. It is a remarkable account of her commitment to student life, to understanding what students could bring to international understanding in what was just then beginning to be a globalized world. So here is a little background, and those of you who know this will forgive me. As some of you may be aware, many of you, something called Student Movement House had its inception just before the end of the First World War. Its goal to memorialize those young people who had died and were still dying at that point in that war. The goal was to promote international understanding and friendship by bringing young people together. The original house was on Russell Square, which was very near the offices of Faber and Faber, where T.S. Eliot was a director. Mary came on the scene, Student Movement House, in 1933, when she became the warden. Mary was born at the end of the 19th century, and she was both, to my mind, a product of her time and a remarkably modern woman in her open-mindedness and the kind of outreach she believed in. She was the eldest of 6. Both of her grandfathers were vicars, and the Trevelyans were a family committed in differing ways to public service. Before she found her vocation, she worked as a music teacher at Radley and Marlborough colleges, and she had studied under Adrian Boult, first conductor of Gustav Holst's famous suite, The Planets, and music remained an enormously important part of her life and formed part of her, one of the most important parts of her connection with T.S. Eliot. She was not, however, steeped in literature, and that's one of the reasons why her friendship with Eliot was so interesting and is interesting to read about, because so much of his circle otherwise was, of course, a strongly literary, cultural circle, and she was the breath of fresh air in his group of friends and colleagues. Of the Trevelyan family, her nephew, Humphrey Carpenter, wrote, "We were not a highly literary family, and though the navy blue spines of the Clarendon Press English poets were ranged formally in the bookcase, there was no Yeats, no Auden, not even Hardy or the Georgians, just John Betjeman and the occasional volume of light verse to indicate that poetry had continued into the 20th century. I rather suspect it was the same with Mary until she met T.S. Eliot. And it kind of remained that way when she did meet him. She was always very forthright about the fact that his writing was not really her business. He didn't share it with her in the way that he did with Emily Hale, the woman who he nearly married and who he kept a little bit secret from Mary. But I'm going to go back a little bit into ancient, what might seem like ancient history, to give you a little sense of Mary in that period. And this is what so impressed me, how adventurous she was and how strong. Without that strength and determination, International Students House wouldn't exist as it is today. My book, as I say, is mainly concerned with her friendship with Eliot, who was the greatest cultural figure of his age. And I had to remind myself, we live in a world of celebrity and of great cultural figures, but the way that we all communicate now, that there are so many different channels of communication and ways for us to find out about what we like and what we care about, that it's hard to conceive of the way in which T.S. Eliot, for better or worse, really bestrode the cultural world in a way that I don't think any artist has since. And the way that he remade 20th century literature and 20th century culture, it's handy for me that this book is published. My book is published in 2022 because that's the 100th anniversary, of course, of the publication of The Wasteland. And it's fascinating to think what it must have been like 100 years ago to open this brand new magazine, The Criterion, and just come across The Wasteland, not knowing anything about it. Amusingly, I think the first in this issue of The Criterion, which Eliot edited, in which The Wasteland appeared, I think the first or the second piece is an essay on dullness. And then you come to The Wasteland. But when they met, it was the beginning of a deep relationship that would last for nearly 20 years. They met in the late 1930s. So she kept a record of that friendship, a manuscript that she called The Pope of Russell Square, and it reveals the depth of their relationship, which lasted until his marriage to his faithful secretary, Valerie, in 1957. But it's so important that Tom, as she called him, as most people called him, shouldn't overshadow this remarkable woman. I have always been fascinated by the trip she took in 1936 to India, Burma, Malay, China, Japan, and the United States, determined to study what happened to students who returned to their home countries after their stays in Britain, and to study how students were treated in those very different countries. She left in the winter of that year, 1936, by ship, and she would take her first flight in an airplane from Karachi to Delhi. Flying in an airplane in 1936, a bit different than now. The pilot invited her to come into the cockpit, and she had to crawl through a narrow passage full of luggage on all fours. But, as she wrote, once there, it was marvelous, though the noise was absolutely deafening and no conversation was possible between the pilot and myself. She was fascinated by everything she saw and receptive to nearly all of it. The one thing she admits to disliking is the food in Japan, where she and I must strongly agree to differ. Her account of what she observed in the United States was especially striking and remains so, particularly in this moment. I will use Mary's terms when I quote her, the language of the 1930s. Not all the words she uses are ones we would use today. Despite admiring the grand student residences she saw in the United States, she observed the country with a gimlet eye, thinking that this grandeur was all on the surface. True international friendship does not gloss over difficulties and differences, but makes opportunities for discussion together, she wrote. She found too much vague sentiment, as she put it, of goodwill. She spent 6 weeks in the US. She went to Hollywood, the Grand Canyon, the Rockies, Niagara Falls. She was very much interested in what she called the particular problem that she was anxious to learn about, that of the American Negro, as she wrote. In New York, she met Elmer Carter, one of the most important figures in the civil rights movement of the time. She called him a man of great wisdom and balance. He was emphatic, she wrote, that a vague enthusiasm for the Negro cause was no help. They wanted recognition and the rights of an American citizen. She met Bill Robinson, the famous tap dancer, and had supper in the Old Colony restaurant, where she was the only white person there. She was stared at and noticed how it felt. I thought of the many colored students whom I had entertained in restaurants in London, when they, doubtless, shared my feelings. She was home in the summer of 1937. Edward VII had abdicated in favor of his brother, George VI. War was brewing. The house then moved to Gower Street into, as she described it, a very tall, thin house, about 100 years old, with a large studio built out behind it, all ready for conversion into the main clubroom. But then in March 1938, and this is around the time that she met Eliot, Hitler marched into Austria, leading to what she called the most difficult period I have ever known in the house, not excepting the outbreak of war a year later. In June of 1940, she had organized a recital by Peter Stadlin, an eminent Austrian pianist who had emigrated to Britain following the Nazi takeover of his homeland. Shortly thereafter, he would be interned in Britain and sent to Australia in 1942. Austrian and German members faced the same fate. At the end of June, we had a pre-internment dance at which every potential internee was greeted as he entered the room with shouts of "Still here?" she wrote. This treatment caused infinite distress to many of our firmest friends, whose one thought had been how they could help Britain to defeat Germany. No matter the terrible events around her, she never lost faith in the possibilities of international cooperation. There were nightly air raids from the 11th of September until the middle of November 1940. For the first time in its history, we had to give up keeping the house open until 10:30 p.m. and took to closing down half an hour before blackout, for the shrapnel was too heavy to allow students to return to their lodgings in safety, and our air raid shelter was far too small for our numbers. On the 23rd of September, the Indian Students' Union, which was the opposite neighbor of the house, took a direct hit. Much damage was done to the house. We were windowless, doorless, ceilingless, gasless, and even waterless for long periods. She wondered if the house should close down, but decided its work was too vital for the students still there. In later years, T.S. Eliot would often come to the nativity play, which was so much of the house's holiday routine. Mary wrote movingly of the performance put on in 1940. There is always, she said, a most unorthodox cast of Christians and non-Christians, played to a very large audience, the majority of whom were not Christian themselves. This year it was a particularly moving occasion and was surely one of the most remarkable presentations of the Christmas story given in this saddest Christmas since Christ was born. There were actors from 7 different countries in this particular play. All over the world, in Germany, Japan, China, Africa, India, Italy are young men and women who have taken part in this play in former years, and some of them at least will have remembered the watchman's cry, God keep our land from hostile hand and fire and brand, and the message of Gabriel, the child that is born to set men free. Her strong Christian faith was something she also shared with T.S. Eliot. It was one of the things that kept them close. Yet she never proselytized and was always open to people of all faiths and interested in their beliefs. I was absolutely fascinated to learn of her adventures in the last years of the war when she traveled with the YMCA to Europe to offer relief for Allied soldiers as the forces of Nazi Germany were gradually beaten back. And these form the basis of her second book, a remarkable epistolary tome, which I think really deserves republication, called I'll Walk Beside You. In it, she gives an account of what she saw, shocking hardship, signs of hope, to a nameless correspondent. In fact, the letters were written to Eliot, though his firm, Faber and Faber, my publisher too, declined to publish this new book. Perhaps it's his turning it down. He didn't approve of books written in the form of letters, isn't quite on a par with his other famous rejection when he turned down the opportunity to publish George Orwell's Animal Farm. But I still believe this little gem of a book was Faber's loss. It was published by Longman in the end. Eliot remained a pretty regular visitor to what eventually became this place, and there was, of course, the founding of the Goats Club. He was one of many speakers she invited to entertain and educate her young charges, and here is a description that she wrote of a visit he made in November of 1956. T visited the University of London Goats Club this evening. I met him by arrangement in the Russell Hotel, where I found him sitting on a high-backed chair in the hall, looking extremely miserable. He really is, and this next bit is in capital letters, he is really quite awful before he has to do anything, and tonight was no exception. He hardly spoke through dinner and appeared to take absolutely no interest in the program he'd insisted I should arrange for him. Very ungracious, in fact. But the moment I took him upstairs in the kitchen lift at University of London Union, he was amused, and he got a tremendous reception from the students. He read well, entertained them with the story of St. Lucy's Day in Sweden, where he had received the Nobel Prize, was photographed with them and agreed to be their president, as well as signing many membership cards. He really enjoyed it, and was, I think, quite touchingly pleased that he is still such a success with the student generation. It is many years since he read to a student audience. In attendance that night was a young Atu Bohen, a Ghanaian goat who would in his later years come to be known as one of the greatest historians of the African continent, and of course wrote a history of this house. As he wrote of this evening, my most vivid memory is that of the visit of T.S. Eliot. As usual, we did not know who the speaker was going to be, but enough hints had been dropped on this occasion to convey the impression that he was a really big man. After the usual waiting and humorous introductory remarks by Mary, we were asked to guess who the guest speaker was. Many suggestions came, and I remember shouting that he was a banker, for the simple reason that the rather detached and cautious look about him reminded me of my then bank manager. Can you imagine my pleasure when he said my guess was not too far off the mark, since he had in fact started life as a bank clerk? He read some of his poems to us, and what an evening it was. And this was 1956. Mary and Tom Eliot had, she believed, a very close friendship now at this point of nearly 2 decades. They went to church together twice on Sundays, often, to an early service and then a later service. He bought her a car. He bought her a Woolsey car because she loved to drive and he didn't like to drive. And she drove him around. They had day trips around London. They went into the countryside. They had a holiday in the Isle of Wight. And she proposed to him not once, but twice. And both times he said in different ways that his past had damaged him too much ever to love anyone again. And this was very difficult for her, but she valued his friendship, their relationship, immensely. Although she was 9 years younger than he was, she did treat him like a naughty little boy. And she took over many of his affairs. She had reason to believe that their relationship might lead to something else. In this period of the mid-50s, he asked her to be his medical proxy, really, that she could go. She was robust as anything. And he was a terrible hypochondriac and always going into the London clinic because he wasn't feeling well. He allowed his doctors to speak to her. So it really did seem like their relationship was going in a particular direction. Plus, he would speak to her, by her account, of course, somewhat scornfully of his troublesome secretary, Valerie Fletcher, who was overbearing and far too attentive. And then at Christmas 1956, so not long after this, they parted. Have a lovely Christmas. See you in the new year. He said he might be going to the south of France. And when she came back in January, she found a postcard dated in early January, saying, by the time you read this, this passive construction, I will have been married to Miss Fletcher. And she was really poleaxed. It should be said she was not the only one. This was a relationship that he kept secret from pretty much everyone in his circle, including his closest friend, John Hayward, with whom he had shared a flat for a long time. They were married at 6 o'clock in the morning in a strange church. And as far as we know, they never saw each other again. She thought he'd gone mad. And she was very hurt by the end of this friendship, although she was not by any means, as you all will know, and this is one of the remarkable things about her, broken by it. She was heartbroken, but she went on to live her extraordinary, robust, adventurous life. Eliot was someone, and we can see this now in not just in my book, but I also commend to you, if you're interested, there's a wonderful new book by Lyndall Gordon, who is a great scholar of Eliot, which is called The Hyacinth Girl. And Lyndall is the first person to have written a book who really got access to an extraordinary cache of over 1,000 letters that Eliot wrote to Emily Hale, the American woman at one point he thought he would marry. Eliot had a tendency to keep the people in his life very, very separate from each other. It is not for me to say whether this is something that men are more likely to do than women. I cannot possibly comment upon that. But he really did in a very particular way. And Mary, what I came to see is that, Mary thought that she was seeing the whole Eliot, and she was only seeing a fragment of Eliot. And what I've tried to do in my book is set their relationship in context. I've stayed very close to her voice and her perception of what she thought was going on in her relationship with Eliot, while showing glimpses of what was on the outside. But it's not surprising that she believed what she did. But she really had little idea of the other sides of Eliot. He was, when he married Valerie, who was nearly 40 years younger than he was, they were, by all accounts, very, very happy together. She was shocked to hear that they went dancing together. She thought that was something that Valerie had introduced to Eliot, that she made him someone who went to parties and dances. She did not know that as a very young man in the United States, he had been a wonderful dancer and he had loved to dance. And Valerie had reawakened this in him when he was long past his creative prime. So Mary is a fascinating part, a very significant part of this extraordinary poet's life, and her perceptions of him really do show him in an unusual and interesting light because, as I said, she wasn't a literary person. So we do see him with his sleeves rolled up, cooking sausages in her flat, which is not an image we often have of the great poet T.S. Eliot. But as I say, and just in conclusion, what I gained in working on this book, which is a project I took on kind of to my own surprise, I feel so fortunate to have met a woman like Mary, whose strength inspires me, whose courage inspires me, whose absolute refusal to be daunted by anything at all really is and remains an inspiration. And that is why I would commend my book to you, not for me, but really for Mary. And I'm honored to have done what I hope is a service to her, and honored to be here tonight. Thank you so much.